Disclaimer warning. This episode contains mention of suicide, depression, and drugs.
I feel like anybody understood what I was going through or couldn't. I don't think that they understand exactly like the pressures or like the hardships that their children deal with.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of So She Can Speak. I'm super excited for today's episode because we'll be talking about the topic of mental health, which I know is a huge topic in many communities. And today we're going to focus on how mental health specifically affects BIPOC communities. Today I have a very special guest, which I will have them introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Xia Xiong. I am a Hmong American woman. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I work professionally in human resources and compliance, and I have a 10-year-old son. He is a biracial kid. He is Black, white, and Asian, and I work in the metro area, but currently working virtually. So that's like a little bit of my professional background. And then I love outdoors. I love art, anything dealing with like creating. And so I was just telling Alysa that me and my sister, we actually have our own podcast too, about a year ago. But that's kind of went vacant just because COVID and everything. And it's taken a huge toll on our families and our personal lives. And so that's been put on pause for now, but I do plan to continue it. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, I'm so excited for when the podcast will come back. We'll definitely have to give that a listen. But we're going to go ahead and talk about more on how mental health exists as an issue and just have a conversation on it. So first off, what are your experiences with mental health, or what are your own thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, it's been a huge part of my life. And I'm sure it's a big part of everybody's life, especially right now during the pandemic. But when I was in high school, as a Hmong woman, a lot of pressure just coming from my parents of doing better, like doing well in school, and a lot of pressure of like being the good daughter and supporting the family in any way that you can. And so like I felt a lot of pressure on that. And then I grew really fast compared to my siblings. And so I constantly had a lot of comments about my body changing and stuff like that. And so I was always like self-conscious about like my body. And I think I had a lot of personally being in relationships, like biracial relationships. My parents didn't take kindly to that, especially because, as a Hmong woman, they just want you to be with a Hmong man. And so that was like, I butted heads with my mom a lot. And me and my mom, we used to be really, really close when I was younger. And that really created a lot of tension in my life. And so that was a really dark period when I had gotten pregnant. I left, and became pretty much a single mom because I was not married. And so I had a lot of like stress around that. And I wasn't in the most like emotionally healthy relationship. My partner then had a lot of mental health issues himself. And so it really caused a lot of stress. It took a toll on my like schooling. And so, yeah, in 2013, my son's dad actually died by suicide. I would put a disclaimer here. It's, I don't know if a lot of people are sensitive about that topic. And so, I just want to, be mindful that that is, it pretty much like threw me into a whole self-love journey or like a self-discovery journey, because at that time I was only 22 and a single mom. And I felt like I didn't have any identity, like I had completely lost myself. And so a lot of I had a lot of mental health issues at that point. And dealing with it was really challenging because I was a young mom. I didn't know what I was doing and I was hurting a lot. And so, yeah, I was kind of stuck in a space where I just really didn't know who I was. Like my whole identity kind of died along with my partner, and I didn't really feel like life could continue the way that it did. And so, it was a really dark time, from 2013 to like 2016. It was really rough. I, like got into really unhealthy habits. I was stress eating, gained a whole ton of weight, was abusing drugs. And I just did a lot of things I knew wasn't good for me. And so, yeah, and all in all, I would say that, the death of my son's dad is like the kickstart to me going through this whole journey of like trying to find myself, and that took a huge toll on my mental health.
Well, thank you so much for sharing and being so honest and genuinely sharing your story out there. I really appreciate the fact that you were being genuine with what you said, and I'm so sorry that you had to go through a loss and all of that. But I mean, you're here today and you showed up very like confidently and strongly, and so I think that's really great.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of shifting points here. Social media is a very prominent force or part of our lives nowadays, and especially within the past decade or so, I think there's been a lot of talk about how social media has a part in creating impacts in our mental health. And so personally, how do you think social media plays a part in that, or could you speak on some of your own experiences with it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for sure, social media is a huge part of how somebody builds their like self-image. And I've learned to use it more in a healthier way, but I was definitely part of that cycle, like going through having like self-image issues, and seeing people like very thin girls like drinking all the smoothies and diet teas and stuff like that. It was very alluring, and like I definitely took all the routes. Like I tried all the products, like anything that you can think of that was a fad in the past 10 years. I was probably on that train for a second, a little bit. Yeah, and I think social media is such a big tool to communicate and like to share your life with the public. And so yeah, it definitely, and you only see the highlights of people's life on social media. They post up only that. And so like, when I was going through a really tough time, it was really hard for me to see all that stuff because it made me feel like hopeless and helpless. Like, wow, like my life could never be like that, just because it just seems so stark and dim. My future just seems so like non-existent when everybody's like living their best lives on social media, and so with my experience, definitely social media impacted a huge deal with just my self-image. But yeah, like I said, I've started to like use social media, like especially with Instagram. Like I used to follow like all the fashion fads and like diet fads, healthy eating tips and stuff like that on Instagram, but now I've really cleaned it out because like none of that stuff works. First and foremost, like don't fall for it. It would not make you love yourself more. It doesn't really give our kids like time to even process what's happening before the next new thing is already happening, and so yeah, I would say that social media has a huge impact on that.
Yeah, and I can definitely relate to a lot that you said because I'm still a teenager and I'm still like growing up and finding who I am, but I'm growing up in this age of social media and seeing everyone else. So it's kind of hard to, accept your own struggles and things like that. But I think definitely nowadays there is so much positive content on social media too, whether that be funny or empowering. So I really appreciate that aspect as well. Thank you for sharing. And then, how do you think mental health is perceived in BIPOC communities? Maybe you can speak specifically on the Hmong community or like the Asian community. And me being like a half Hmong person myself, I definitely know that mental health can be such a mental health can be such a stigma.
I think that there's not enough like seriousness like being taken around somebody's mental health, and like, be a Hmong woman, I feel like my parents are always like dismissive, like when I tell them that I'm sad or something. And like my parents, I just remember having a conversation with my mom, and she would just be like, what do you got to be sad for? Like, you just get over it, like there's no reason for you to be sad. You have everything. You live in America, like you can have anything, and like there's nothing lacking in your life. What do you got to be sad for? And so I think like part of the big issue is just like being willing to hear your children out, for them to talk about their like hardships, right? And I think that my parents and like their parents' generation suffered through so much trauma that this stuff does seem trivial, like, and I get it, but I don't think that they understand exactly like the pressures or like the hardships that their children deal with being here and being in that space of like trying to discover yourself in a new land, or like in America where, you have to speak English, but then you have to be Hmong, like, and so I think the duality of that is really hard to like tease out for my parents, and they didn't really fully understand what I was going through. And that really made it difficult for me, just because like it made me feel like so alone. And I think a lot of kids these days must feel that, because we've had like a uptick in like teen suicides within the Hmong community just in the past couple of years. And that's all related to mental health and whatever that's happening in their families and in their lives, isn't being taken seriously enough, or they're not feeling heard, or there's just not enough resources. And I know like, specifically in the Hmong community, like a lot of these things are dealt with or like understood in a spiritual context, like they think that there's something wrong with your spirit. And so like they will try to like do a spirit cleansing or a spirit calling for you, and sometimes that's just not the case. Like sometimes you need to seek out help, and I also just don't think that there is enough spaces created, or women, and especially being a Hmong woman, I just feel like whether you are a daughter or a friend or a nya, like in-law, like if you marry into another person's family, and you just don't feel particularly comfortable or open enough in any space to like talk about your problems and talk about your struggles, versus like, and I feel like that's a little different than just venting, right? Or like venting or like gossiping. Like, yeah, there's not enough spaces for that. And so I think it's a lot of like layers of barriers there. And then like, yeah, access to just healthcare professionals that can understand what you're going through, without you having to go through the trouble of like educating somebody, right? Because like I definitely went through therapy, and I think half the time was spent on me just educating my therapist on my culture. And that was like a huge struggle. And I had to pay for that. So like literally with money. And so, yeah, I think it's definitely multi-layered.
I definitely agree with all that you brought up. And especially in families, it's really hard to bring up the issue because, parents don't see it as a problem. And I think specifically for Asian families too, you're held to such high expectations and standards, and not being able to live up to that can be really difficult. And I've been researching on mental health too, and a lot of times in like refugee or immigrant families, we have what you call an intergenerational gap. Like there's such a difference between like your parents who might have come over versus you who are born in America, and that can make things really difficult or make things even more difficult for your mental health. I also really want to point out all the problems that you talked about when it comes to mental health barriers in the Asian community, or for really all BIPOC folks, is that there's not really a therapist who can truly understand you coming from their perspective, and a lot of the times it feels like you have to like explain yourself, even though that's not really what they're there for. But yeah, so I'm really glad that we got you on the podcast to bring your understanding, because I feel like you have a really in-depth idea of like how BIPOC folks and especially the Asian community are affected.
Thanks for watching part 1 of this episode on mental health. Be sure to stay tuned for part 2.
I was really in a space of like self-blame. Like I really thought that, like this is all my fault.